Good morning, everybody. We're excited to be together today. I'm just waiting to hear from my peeps that we are live and ready to go. And then we are going to get right into things this morning. And so it looks like I've got a message coming in. So that is great. Well, good morning and welcome to Pathway Community Church, to our online service. We're glad that you're with us today. If you joined us last week, we began a brand new series called Stay Positive. And what we're going to be talking about through this series is how we cultivate positivity as a way of our being. Today, I'm going to encourage you, if you don't have a pen and paper or a phone or some kind of device, you may want that. I'm going to get you to, we're going to get some stuff together. We're going to do some things together to try to move us in this direction of rewiring our brains. So I encourage you to get a pen and paper or a device handy so that you can jot some things down a little bit later in the service. Well, as we began our series, Stay Positive, last week, we talked a little bit about negativity. And just kind of wanted to give a bit of a demonstration of how things often work, because part of the problem is, this is this pepper here that I have represents kind of the negativity, and unfortunately for many of us, we have allowed this negativity to become our dominant source of thinking. And if you look at this bowl, you can kind of see the pepper is all around here. And as we have created neural pathways that lead us toward negativity, the negativity becomes the dominant pathways that our brain uses. And we actually use negativity, and we don't do this on purpose necessarily, but we use negativity to create neural pathways. And what we want to do as part of this series is we want to change the wiring of our brain so that rather than negativity, we have positivity. And what that does is it pushes all the negativity out to the side, and it ends up becoming the dominant way that we see things. It's a little bit hard to see. But essentially what happens is when we think about the positive, we can begin to rewire our brain so that the negativity is on the periphery and the main stuff becomes the positive. And that's what we want to do as part of this sermon series. Again, we took most of last week to talk about negativity and why it's so prominent and where it actually comes from. That's kind of where we began last week. And as we go through the series, we're going to reference some of this brain science stuff that we talked about last week. If you haven't had a chance to listen to last week, I do encourage you to go back and have a listen through it, because I think I know I'm writing the series. It's going to be really valuable to you. We're going to reference the brain science a lot, and some of the things that we talked about last week, because the importance of rewiring our brain is rooted in understanding some of how our brains work. And so I encourage you to go back and have a listen to that if you haven't yet. Today, as we carry on, we're going to make a shift toward what it means to have a more positive disposition, to rewire or renew our minds in such a way that we are more positive. Speaking of positivity, I did want to share some exciting news with you. One of our worship leaders, Becky Hovey, some of you know her. She plays keyboard and leads worship fairly regular at Pathway. Anyway, she got married last weekend to Ian. So we want to say a huge congratulations to you guys. We're excited for you as you start this next chapter of your life together. And just wanted to wish you a great congratulations, to share that wonderful news with our Pathway family. When we think about things like positivity, happiness, thanksgiving, and joy, words like this strike something inside of us. I think for the vast majority of people, they would like a little more happiness, a little more joy, a little more peace, a little more gratitude in their life. In fact, this has actually come to light in many studies that have been done. In her book, The Happiness Project, Gretchen Rubin talks about numerous studies that reveal that people long for, crave, and try to chase down happiness. At the end of life, that's what people want more of. They just want more joy, more happiness, more contentment, more peace. And this quest for happiness, This quest for joy isn't something that's new to our culture. In case you're sitting there thinking, well, yeah, that's because that's our culture. That's how we are. No, no, no. This has existed for a long time. Listen to this quote by philosopher Blaise Pascal, who was writing in the 1600s. He wrote this in a compilation of some of his works called Human Happiness. This is what he wrote. All people seek happiness. There are no exceptions. However different the means they may employ, they all strive towards this goal. This is written in the 1600s, and he's saying all people are looking for happiness. We all long for more positivity and joy and happiness, but negativity, like we talked about in our experiment with the pepper, comes so naturally to us, and it dominates our main thought life. That's why we need to rewire the brain with positivity. We need to rewire our brains to think more naturally about positive things. And that's where we're going to head over the next several weeks. We're going to talk about and get a good grounding in how we cultivate positivity. And I said this last week, but I want to be straightforward with you. This is going to take effort. You're not going to come here on Sunday mornings, gather together online, hear some teaching, walk away and be like, whew, all done. Positive now. No, this is going to take work. It is going to take effort if we are going to reprogram and rewire our brains. Not only do we read that from different Christian authors, but we see that in the Bible. We also see that from scientists, that this is possible, but it is going to take effort. As we go through this series, I do want to encourage you to keep sending in your questions. In the notes section, you'll see the text message number there. You can text in questions. You can put them in the chat. We do have people who are kind of keeping an eye on the chat for me while I'm doing this. And you can also email them to me. I actually had a great question come in after the service last week that I really appreciated. And the person said this. They said, how can we reconcile being positive while not being naive? In other words, there are people in our world experiencing poverty, racism, and social justice is missing in so many aspects of our life. So how do we be positive while not being naive? And I love this question, and I'm glad for it because, excuse me, sadly, it's far too often that this is the way positivity is used. And we're going to talk about what true positivity means and how we reconcile that with some of the things we see in our world. The question leads perfectly into our topic for today as we shift into what positive thinking is. But before we get to that, let's talk about this idea of renewing our thoughts and what it is not. When we talk about this idea of rewiring our brain or renewing our minds, this is a biblical concept that we find, and we're going to study that passage again a little bit more today. But let's just pause and begin by saying what it isn't. The person who I was talking with had referenced an episode of Odyssey, Adventures in Odyssey actually, called Count It All Joy. And in this episode, it's a great little episode, and Erica, the girl in the episode, is kind of a gloomy Gus. She's kind of negative about everything. Everything is the worst. Her family is the worst. Her sister is the worst. Her job is the worst. Everything is the worst. And so she's kind of complaining, and as she talks to Whitaker, and she talks to a friend of hers, Jenny, at the Whit's Cafe, I forget the name of it. Some of you all know, and you'll put it in the comments. That's great. I can't remember what the cafe is called. But as she's talking to them, they tell her this verse from the book of James that says, count it all joy. And so what she does is she plasters this smile on her face, and she goes about her day. And no matter what happens to her, it's like, count it all joy, count it all joy. Just count it all joy. And a friend comes to her in trouble, and she's like, oh, just start all over. Oh, everything's great. Oh, it'll be fine tomorrow. Don't worry about it. And she is oblivious to the pain that this young friend of hers is experiencing. She's oblivious to the struggle going on inside of him. She had a faulty understanding of what it means to stay positive, to count it all as joy, to be a good news person. And so I want to start this idea of renewing our minds toward the positive by looking at what it is not. Retraining our brain to be positive is not unicorns and cotton candy. There's this great episode of Friends, and Phoebe is dating this character on there named Parker. And Parker is this guy that everything is over positive. At one point they're in a traffic jam, and he says, "Oh, the world is aglow with a million fireflies," as he's talking about the tail lights. And he and Phoebe end up getting into a fight because it's just it's too much. It's over the top. And so she slams the door on him, and he leaves, and then knock, knock, knock the door. He opens the door. "Isn't this just the best fight you've ever had?" It's like ridiculous. And yet so often when we talk about joy, this is the kind of thing that people have in their minds. It's this denial of reality. It's this pretending that everything is awesome. It's a slapping a fake smile on your face when everything isn't great and pretending it's all fine. Oh, everything's good. And that is not what we're talking about. We talk about retraining our brain toward positivity. It is not pretending we live in some utopian place where nothing goes wrong. That is not what we're talking about here. The second thing, retraining your brain to see the positive is not. It is not positive self-talk rooted in yourself. We're not talking here about talking yourself up. Oh, you just have to believe in yourself. I referenced this last week and I couldn't help but print it off, like the unicorn and the therapist. And the therapist says, first, you just must believe in yourself. That is not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about some pie in the sky way of thinking about things. This is where this positivity often, people will take Philippians 4:13 out of context in this way. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I can play in a symphony if I really try. I can be a goalie in NHL if I just really try. Or I can play professional soccer if I just really try. And the truth is, that's just not reality. It doesn't mean I'm not positive to say that reality is I will never be those things. I was talking with Tony last week, and he showed me some videos of his grandson, Reese, playing soccer. And I could tell you, I can't be a professional soccer player. That kid is built like a soccer player. I mean, he is fast. He is athletic. He's got talent. He's got a great mind for the game. He's got an excellent work ethic. And yet he might or might not make it because that's the reality. It doesn't mean we aren't positive when we have a grounding in reality. See, being positive isn't this self-talk that says, oh, nothing bad will ever happen to me. Oh, I'll have my whole life figured out. Oh, nothing bad can enter my way. That's not what we're talking about. In the book Optimism Bias, Tali Sharot actually explains that while many of us look at the world negatively and we see the world as being messed up in a terrible place, we see ourselves in a more positive light. The divorce rate is 40%, but we say it won't happen to me. They did a study as part of her research. And what they did was they gathered up groups of students and they put them into groups to do projects. And then what they did at the end of the project is, and this was a part where they didn't let anybody, it was, you couldn't tell anybody else. It was confidential. And they had each person write down, that was part of each group, how much of the work they thought they did. Well, when they tallied up the numbers from each group and averaged them out, the average percentage of work done was 139% because everybody believed they had done more work than other people. Cultivating positivity is not about unrealistic expectations or views of yourself. And finally, retraining your brain to see the positive is not denying the evil, injustice, pain, and sin we see in the world. We are not advocating here in this series that we stick our head in the sand as if stuff isn't really going on around us. The truth is we live in a world that isn't perfect. And in fact, the passage that we've been kind of centering in, and we're going to look at over the next several weeks, is the book of Romans, chapter 8. And even in the book of Romans, chapter 8, verses 20 to 22, Paul is actually talking here about the fact that creation has been subjected to sin, and that creation even though creation is amazing, it in and of itself has experienced sin. It isn't in its perfect state, and it groans, is what Paul says, to be liberated. Our world is not as it should be. There is evil, injustice, pain, suffering, sin, racism, poverty, illness, famine, natural disasters. And as followers of Jesus, we don't deny those things. Rather, we work toward bringing God's peace, his shalom, and caring for our world. The thing is, if you read the Gospels for any length of time, you won't get very far without seeing that these troubling issues made Jesus quite upset too. Though people wanted to be around Jesus and loved Jesus, though his burden was light, Jesus was not oblivious to the pain that he saw around him. That's why even in the story of where he raises Lazarus from the dead, knowing full well what he was about to do, he still wept as he saw the grief and pain of the people around him. What we're talking about through this series is realistic positivity. Being positive, retraining our brain to search for positives, does not mean we ignore the negatives. It doesn't mean we minimize the negatives or pretend that they don't exist. See, we can realistically see the world, the stuff that is not right, and still experience joy and still see the good. That's in fact what the scripture writers are getting at when they tell us about this. Paul, in his letter to the Philippians, we talked about this a little bit last week, Philippians 4, verse 4, he says, "Rejoice in the Lord always." I say it again, rejoice. He's calling us to a life of joy, and he's doing that while in prison. But he's not oblivious to the fact that he has almost died, faced intense persecution, and is now sitting in a prison. He doesn't candy coat that or sugarcoat that and say, but it's okay, I like it here. That's not ever what Paul says. He talks about finding joy in the midst of that. He talks about the fact that we can find positives, find good, see good, even in the midst of the darkness. See, Paul, throughout his writings, is very aware that everything isn't cotton candy and unicorns. It's why he calls out many different things. When he writes to the Corinthian church, he calls out the fact that the rich believers were not associating with the poor believers. They were ignoring them. He calls out at other times believers who are taking advantage of others or living in ways that were sinful apart from God. Jesus takes a similar approach. We see him calling out those who have turned the house of prayer into a den of thieves, or calling out the Pharisees for making it difficult for people to get to God. He calls out his own disciples for keeping the children from coming to Jesus. Jesus was very aware of evil, and he was very quick to address. And yet we still find that his yoke is easy and his burden is light, and he promises peace in the midst of trouble. The idea here is not to ignore what's going on, but to train to see the positives as well as the negatives. In The Science of Positivity, Loretto Graziano gives a great example of this. She talks about the idea that when it comes to pollution, we still have a long way to go. But most of the time, we see it as a crisis. Oh, there's a crisis in the pollution. It's so bad. It's so bad. And yet we never think about how far we've come. Rarely do we reflect on the good work that has been done. And she gives the example of her grandmother, whose lungs were coated in coal because that's what they were doing. In that time, they dumped whatever into the water. And now that doesn't happen. And now corporations are regulated in terms of their emissions. And we've made strides. And it doesn't mean we hide our heads in the sand saying, oh, everything's perfect then. No, we still want to prevent plastics from going into our oceans. And we still want to protect our natural resources. That is a good trait. That's the first command, right? Care for this world. That's what God calls Adam and Eve to tend the garden. But we can see the negative and the stuff we still need to do while still acknowledging the positives, the distance we've come, the way things have improved. Too often, everything is crisis mode. Everything is falling apart. Everything is the worst it's ever been because our brains scan for the negative and they find evidence to support, oftentimes, most often, skipping over the positives. I think this is why James doesn't ignore trials. But in his verse, and this is the verse that the Odyssey episode referenced, but James says, consider it pure joy when you face trials of all kinds. He doesn't minimize trials. He's not saying you won't face trials or pretend they don't exist. He's just saying consider it joy. You can experience joy even in the face of trouble. We can find peace in the middle as we are transformed by the renewing of our minds. Again, Paul calls us to this in Romans 12:2. He says, don't conform to the patterns of this world. Don't think like this world. Don't act like this world. Don't be like that. Where negativity is often the bent. He says, don't do that. He said, instead, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you can test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. The battle toward positivity begins in our minds, getting our thinking right. Jonathan Edwards put it well when he said, the ideas and images in people's minds are the invisible powers that constantly govern them. The ideas and images, the stuff going on up here, are the invisible powers that constantly govern them. We have to get our thinking right and make a shift in what we think about. We touched on it last week, but I want to spend a little more time today looking at Philippians 4:4-8. So I want to invite you to turn with me there to Philippians chapter 4. And this is, Paul is in Romans 8, encourages to get our mind right, to focus on things of the Spirit. Romans 12, he says it again, don't conform, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. In Philippians, Paul gives a list of the kinds of things that we should think about. He says, always be full of joy in the Lord. I say it again, rejoice. Let everyone see that you're considerate in all you do. Remember, the Lord is coming soon. Don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. Tell God what you need and thank him for all you've done. Then you will experience his peace, which exceeds anything we understand. His peace will guard your hearts and minds as you live in Christ. And now, dear brothers and sisters, one final thing. Fix your thoughts on what is true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about things that are excellent and worthy of praise. I want to spend our remaining time thinking about these and unpacking them a little bit, as I think it's going to be helpful for us today. So often we can read a verse like this and go, yeah, whatever is true, whatever is right, whatever is noble, whatever is lovely, whatever is pure. We can kind of get this like rhyming off of the list without ever contemplating what those things actually mean for us. Now, as a caveat to what we're going to talk about today, because someone might ask this or wonder this, yes, the beautiful part of this passage is that God is the perfect summation of all these things. When you read, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is righteous, whatever is pure, lovely, admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, that really does describe God quite well. But I want to take it a step further, because throughout our day, we want to reflect on God 100%. If we could keep God in the front of our mind, again, Brother Lawrence talked about the presence of God in his writings and thinking to himself, Jesus. He was washing dishes. He experiences the presence of God. We want that. And God is the perfect picture of all these things. But Paul actually uses a word here that broadens this spectrum. And he says in each one of these, before the word, he says, whatever is. We want to think about God as our perfect example. We can't go wrong here. But this use of whatever is important. According to Frank Thielman, who wrote the NIV application commentary on the book of Philippians, he said that Paul seems to place special emphasis on the breadth of these qualities. This is the whatever is true, whatever is right, whatever is noble. He says he places a special emphasis on the breadth, that's the enormity of these qualities, by repeatedly using the indefinite adjective whatever. He tells the Philippians to look for the true, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, excellent, and praiseworthy everywhere around them, and to ponder these things in which these qualities are exemplified. In other words, While God is the perfect summation, we can look around and see these things. And when we see these things, they do actually point us to God. They actually reflect God. In fact, I think that's a great litmus test. If you want to know if something is one of these qualities, ask the question, does it reflect God? That said, rewiring the brain, renewing the mind, as Paul terms it, requires thinking about whatever is true. The first word that Paul gives in this description is whatever is true. The word here means the actuality of a thing. It is grounded in reality. It's not some pie in the sky, whatever, fakey thing. It's, no, whatever is true. He says, whatever you find that's true, think about this. One of the wonderful truths that I learned years ago that I've come to appreciate so much is that all truth is God's truth. All truth. Anytime something is true, then it's God's truth, because God is truth. He cannot tell a lie. That's what the scriptures tell us. And so God, because he is truth, all truth becomes his truth. And so anything we can learn that's true. You know, we're learning about brain science. And brain science, the truth of that doesn't make it any less godly. In fact, it points to a creative God who is ingenious in his way of creating the human brain. We're not talking here, though, about things that are maybe true or things that are, that's why Paul says don't be taken captive by philosophies and by all kinds of worldly things. He says, no, whatever is true. The second thing he says, whatever is noble. The word here means something like dignity or honorable. That's what the New Living Translation uses, is honorable. These are things that deserve honor and respect. He says, think about those things. And some of the synonyms for this are things that are high-minded or principled, estimable, things that are worthy or meritorious. When we find those things that have dignity or that bring honor, Paul says, think about those things. Get those things in your brain. Don't think about the crude and the lewd and the shrewd. Think about the things that are honorable. The third one he says is think about things that are righteous. And the word here means just. Think about things that are full of justice. See, we should have eyes to see the things in our world where justice is on display, where we see justice happening. And we should focus on these things and learn from it and think on it. Whatever is right. Whatever is righteous is the word there. It's this idea of justice and righteousness. Those things are tied together throughout the scriptures. This can be reflecting on things or people where this characteristic is displayed. People like a Corrie ten Boom, who risked her own life and went to a concentration camp to hide and care for Jewish people during the Holocaust. Or Martin Luther King Jr., who fought against racism in a peaceable way. Whatever is righteous. He carries on, whatever is pure. And the idea here is that these are things that are free from contaminants. Whatever is pure. In other words, we don't focus on things that are impure, things that are going to lead our minds down paths that are unhelpful or unwholesome. We focus on things that are good. And this isn't just things, that we watch, but it can also be conversations. It can be the way we talk. Things that can contaminate our thought life can be things like malice or anger towards somebody else or bitterness or jealousy. Anything that we see that would tear others down or be cynical or mocking. Paul says, no, focus on what is pure. Be free from that stuff. He says anything that is lovely. Anything that is lovely. And here I think we talk about beauty. You ever wonder why people feel so close to God when they're in nature? Or when people will say they feel more peaceful in nature, or they experience more appreciation or calmness or clarity? I think it's because they're seeing beauty. And beauty, when you have time to appreciate and think on beauty, has a way of bringing joy to the soul. I also would say beauty points to and reveals a wonderful creator. When I was in Switzerland several years ago, I had the opportunity to go as part of a mission trip I was on. And we went to the Swiss Alps. And I remember being just in awe at this place. And the beauty and wonder of it just drew me closer. He carries on, if anything is admirable. Other translations actually say, if anything is of good report, think on these things. I like that idea. If anything is of good report. And most of the commentaries I read really honed in on that, saying, he's saying here to focus on the good. Focusing on things of good report. This is not the bad attention, not giving so much our attention to the bad news. But instead, we focus our attention on the good news, the good stories, the good things. Again, this is this idea of opening our eyes to see the positive all around us. If anything is of good report, center your thoughts there. If anything is excellent or praiseworthy, if we see something that is awesome, that is worthy of sharing, that is amazing, think about that. When you see someone who exemplifies something great, that's praiseworthy. Not praiseworthy in the sense of worshiping them, but praiseworthy in the sense of saying, yeah, this is awesome. This is excellent. It's worth commending them for. When we see things like that, Paul says, think about those kinds of things. If something is excellent, if something is praiseworthy, encourage them. If something is praiseworthy, give her. Seeing the good in others, I think, can actually decrease our jealousy, our urge to tear down, and our urge to compare. Let me give you a couple of takeaways as we wrap up this morning. Takeaway number 1, renewing your mind may feel forced at first. Well, you may not realize it, and we've been talking about this over the last few weeks, our negativity is actually biased as well. When you start trying to think about positive, you might feel like you're forcing it, or like it feels like you're biased towards positive. I'm trying to find it. But what you don't realize is that your negativity is biased as well. We are biased towards seeing and feeling and picking out the negative. We are programmed to scan for that. And so as we begin to renew our minds, focusing on things that are true and noble and righteous and pure and lovely and admirable and excellent and praiseworthy, it might feel a tad forced at first because you are going against the grain of the way your brain typically has been wired to work. So as you work toward renewing your mind, as you work toward this week focusing on whatever is true and right and lovely and just and admirable and excellent and praiseworthy, I want to encourage you that even when it feels forced, push through. And as you go through, and again, this is so important, you're going to have to be aware of your own negativity because you're going to naturally want to revert back to this, to your own Eeyore tendencies. If you're not aware of it, you may revert back and continue to operate on autopilot. One of the things that we can do here, and I'm a big advocate for this, is finding someone who will be honest with you, finding someone who will help you, finding someone who will gently, in love, point these things out to you. I encourage you to kind of think about that. Second thing, what I've come to learn in my life is that if we don't set goals, we often don't put things into practice. It's great to say we're going to renew our minds. Yeah, I agree. This is what Paul says, that we should be renewed and be transformed by renewing our mind and thinking about these positive things. Yes, I affirm that. And that's great. I'm glad you affirm it. But if you don't intentionally find ways to put it into practice, this week will go by and you will have hardly thought about it again. We can't just hear it and then go, okay, from now on I'm going to be like Mary Poppins and think happy thoughts. It's not going to work like that. It's not going to happen on its own. And like we said last week, and we'll keep saying through this series, it is going to take you effort. If you want to increase your positivity quotient or be transformed by the renewing of your mind, it's going to take intentionality. And so as you get out your paper, I want to encourage you today with two things. I'm going to give you two ways that you could begin to put this into practice to begin to rewire your brain. These came from 2 different books I read. I loved them both. And I thought some will work for some and some will work for others. So I'm going to give you both. And one of the things you can do is 3 positive things a day. And this is how I would encourage you to do this. This isn't a gratitude exercise. That's not what I'm talking about here, though that's a great thing to do too. What I'm talking about is creating a chart or getting a calendar maybe. And you go, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And create your columns like this. And then each day, what I want you to do, again, if you really want to take this seriously, this is going to be a 6-week challenge for you. But write down 3 positive things. Now, don't do them all at once. Don't do them all at once. You're going to have to take this with you. But space them out throughout the day. Maybe you need to set an alarm. And set an alarm for 3 times a day that's going to go off at times where you're not going to be in meetings or you're not going to be distracted or you're not going to be, whatever. And write down 3. And the key to this is, don't just think about positive things like, oh, puppy dogs. I like puppy dogs. No, we're talking here about things that are part of your life. Think about positive things that are part of your life. So maybe you go through a meeting and maybe the meeting doesn't go as well as you thought. But you did notice a colleague or a coworker who was affirming you and nodding their head, or maybe they come over and say, I really appreciated what you had to say in that meeting. Thank you. And maybe everybody else didn't agree with you, but that person did. You can say, wow, the negative, of course, you can focus on, nobody liked it. Everybody hated it. But that's not true. And so maybe you write down, I was glad that so-and-so recognized where I was going and affirmed my thoughts. Or I'm glad I felt understood in this moment. I mean, it can also be things like a thankfulness for a meal or a thankfulness for water or a thankfulness, for a home. Those are all fine too. But don't use them more than once. So as you go through this exercise, you're going to have to start scanning for the positives. And it will get easier as you begin to rework and rewire your brain. So create a calendar, buy a calendar, do whatever you want to do, set it up, and write down your 3 positive things. And I encourage you to write them down, because if you don't write them down, you may not make them happen. The second thing you can do is create a positivity chart. Now, this was actually a chart created by Benjamin Franklin. And what Benjamin Franklin used to do is he created these list of virtues. And the list of virtues were all kinds of things like temperance, silence. He has on here order, resolution, frugality. And what Benjamin Franklin did was he would put check marks or X's if he exemplified or lived out that trait that day, that virtue that day. And he would make notes about where he maybe didn't do so well or maybe where he did. And so the way that you could use this is, I wouldn't use his exactly, but write down some traits of positivity, some things that you think you want to increase your positivity quotient in. This could be things like relationships. It could be things like your work. It could be things like your parenting, friendships. It could be things like your thought life, your social media habits. You know you, and you know where you need to improve and increase your positivity quotient. And then the way that you work on this chart is you list those things down and you begin to say what you would like to see and what that means. So maybe in relationship with a friend, you say, I want to do a better job of connecting with that friend. And when I'm with that friend, I always tend to be negative and we hash about all the bad things. I'm going to be more positive. And so be specific as you create your goals. And then again, notice he's got a day of the week chart at the top. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And what Benjamin Franklin would do is each day he would check off how he did on those. It's a way of keeping yourself accountable to thinking more positive. If you want to talk about these anymore, if you have any questions about these, do feel free to send those in to me. Again, I can set up a call with you this week. We could talk about some ways that you can implement these. But I really want to encourage you to do this, to spend some time this week thinking about what virtues you would put in to shift your thinking to more positive. What areas of your life Instead of a virtue chart, what areas of your life do you need to experience more positivity? And how can you go about seeing that happen? Let me pray for you as we go our separate ways today. Lord, we thank you for today, and we thank you for your word to us. God, this list of things that we should focus on, if we would just focus on these, we would truly retrain our minds to focus more on you, to see more of you in our world around us. God, so often we can be deceived and sucked into the negativity and the lies of the enemy that wants us to think and feel and be more dark and gloomy. God, we want to be light. So God, help us to see the positives, not ignore the difficulties, not ignore the struggle, not ignore the pain, but to also see and scan for the positives and not always just go to the negatives. God, we want to be transformed into people of light in our world. So help us, we pray, in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, as you go, may you go with God's peace this week. I encourage you to take time today even to begin figuring out whether you're going to do your 3 positives a day or your chart, and get that started. If you put it off till tomorrow, you may never do it. And our desire is to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. A reminder to you, no Zoom lobby today. We'll resume that next week. Don't forget communion next week. And youth, I look forward to seeing you guys today at the bonfire and pool party at my place. Looking forward to that. Have a great day again. Great week, everybody. Bye-bye.